Budget gaming. Fractal Design is proud to introduce their new Celsius Plus lineup of all-in-one CPU water coolers available in either dynamic or Prisma. The tinted glass pump face reveals the LED backlight logo and ARGB LED effects, while the smart auto control dynamically adjusts pump and fan speeds based on temperature for the perfect balance of silence and cooling performance. To see the full list of features and sizes available, head to the sponsored link in the description below. Talking about high-end hardware is always fun. I mean, I don't think anyone would disagree. Like, if you had the opportunity and someone tossed you the keys to a Lamborghini, you're gonna go for a ride. And you're gonna be kind of sad at the end of the day you can't take it home, but you still enjoyed going along for that ride. Well, a lot of people never even get the ability to even experience a high-end gaming computer, which is why when we see the advancements of architectures make their way down to the entry-level part numbers, or the part SKUs, it's exciting because you start to get a taste of what it's actually like with the higher-end hardware. Now, right now, you might have heard a couple weeks ago, AMD launched some of the information regarding their two new entry number or level SKUs, the 3100 and the 3300X. Now, to kind of put a lot of rumors aside, a lot of people were like, well, it's just a 3200G with the Navi stripped out, and it's just a 3400G with the Navi stripped out. And it's really not. These are completely different parts from the ground up. Now, no, they don't have Navi graphics in there. They're not APUs. But both of these parts are 4-core, 8-thread parts. So they both have SMT, or simultaneous multi-threading. Today, we're going to kind of focus on one of the CPUs, and that's going to be the 3300X. And that's for several reasons. One, AMD, during the press conference, or the press meeting that we had, made a claim in there that we really wanted to test, and that is that the 3300X has caught up and passed the 7700K, which, mind you, is only 3 years old. It's a Q1 2017 part that for the longest time was like the gaming king CPU. Remember, that was during an era where you could only get 4-core 8-thread on mainstream with Intel. None of this, 10-core 20-thread stuff like you have in 3 years. Thank you, Ryzen, for causing the CPU battles that have taken place to give you more for your money moving forward. But that doesn't change the fact that a lot of people don't have $500 to spend on a CPU. Enter this $120 part. So we're going to be comparing this $120 CPU in 2020 versus a nearly $400 CPU from 2017. One that I'm sure many of you are still running right now. Now, if you're one of those that are running a 7700K Intel system and you suddenly hear that one of AMD's lowest price CPUs has matched and potentially surpassed it, that's kind of a scary thought, right? But it's a fun thought. The 3100 we'll talk about later on in a full budget build guide of a $100 CPU. So anyway, the specs. It is based on the TSMC 7nm FinFET architecture. So it is a brand new part from the ground up, like I've said. So it's Zen 2, obviously. It's got 256 KB of L1 cache, 2 megabytes L2, and 16 megabytes of L3. I've already said they are both 4-core 8-thread parts with SMT. They're AM4 socket, obviously. They are compatible with B450 motherboards and potentially even B320s, I think they're called. That might be the Intel part. Anyway, you probably won't need a BIOS update to even run them, because to be fair, we are using the Gigabyte X570 UD that we bought with this $2,000 build. I updated the BIOS, but the BIOS predates the CPU's announcement, and it has no mention of it having the latest CPU compatibility in there, but it runs just fine. Also too, in terms of setting, everything is disabled in terms of any sort of core enhancement, any sort of overclocking. The only thing we did was set the memory to its XMP/DOCP profile of 3000 megahertz. We did the same thing on the 7700K system, which is not on the table here. That's a 7700K running an MSI Z270 motherboard. They are using the same exact graphics card. We took our EVGA GeForce RTX 2080 Super, which is a dual fan card, not a big custom, it's a founder's PCB or a reference PCB. But we did overclock the card because what we're looking for here is the bottleneck. We want to find a bottleneck and see how both CPUs handle it. The 7700K is also running 16 megabytes of 3000 megahertz memory. I forgot to mention this is 16 gig over here. They're both the same in terms of memory speeds, and settings on the systems were exactly identical. Basically fresh installs on both of these systems. Updated on 1909, all the updates, same exact drivers, as A to B comparison as we could possibly make it. Now let's talk about both test systems real quick. They are both running the latest version of Windows 1909. All the updates have been installed. They both are running high performance mode in the desktop power settings. We want to make sure Windows is not controlling the CPUs at all. They are having no overclocking applied whatsoever to the CPUs. They are out of the box settings with the exception of the memory, which we talked about running at 3000 megahertz. And then Windows Defender is running on each system. So we kind of set it up with a fresh install on both systems of basically how we think an out-of-the-box install with a fresh system would go. There's no other bloatware going, there's no monitors or any of that stuff. Even MSI Afterburner wasn't running when we were doing our testing, but we did overclock the graphics card. The graphics card has a plus 75 megahertz overclock on the core. It has a plus 500 megahertz overclock on the memory. Power limit's at 116, so 16% additional power draw allowed to it. Core voltage slider hasn't been touched, and the fan was set to 100%. Well, Jay, why are you doing that? One, we want to remove any GPU throttling or fluctuation of core speed based on the temperature curve to make sure that things are as consistent as possible. Two, the case side panel was open. I wanted to make sure the case didn't introduce any sort of artificial slowdowns in terms of those P states and temperature states. And then three, we want to make sure that we are pushing more FPS to the CPU than we think it can handle. Because what we're looking at here is how each of these systems handle a graphics card that is a mismatch. Now, why do I call it a mismatch? A 7700K at nearly $400 in 2017, the best GPU you could have possibly got at the time was a 2080 Ti. I think the Ti was out by then, potentially.
2080 Ti?
Or 1080 Ti, yeah.
It's like, wait, wow.
It's been around that long, right? It had I believe 1080 Ti was available in Q1 2017, but a lot of people would have run a 1080 Ti with it because it was still the best mainstream CPU you could possibly get for Intel. When you take a $120 CPU and then put an $800 graphics card on there, that's a poor mismatch. But if these two are equal, like AMD claims, then that also makes the 2080 Super a poor mismatch for a 7700K. So we did CPU tests as well as GPU tests in there. All the GPU tests are at 1080p for the very same reason we just said, as many frames as possible to see how the CPUs handle it. So let's let these two battle right now and see how the results turn out. All right, starting with the Blender benchmark, and you guys can actually download this if you want. If you just go to Google and look up Blender benchmark and you download it, you can run the test yourself and compare your results to this CPU if you're curious if it would be any sort of an update to you in this app anyway. The 3300X did our BMW test in 325 seconds. The 7700K did it in 338 seconds. So there's two things happening here. You have the superior IPC of the Zen 2 architecture versus a much older architecture from Intel. So just like the argument today of, well, IPC versus core clock, well, if the core clock is much closer, then the IPC definitely becomes king. And that was evident, you know what I'm trying to say? That was evident in the benchmark. Let's go ahead now and take a look at the next test on here, which was Cinebench R20. Interesting thing about this is Cinebench does take advantage of AVX instructions. Those don't exist on AMD. So what you're seeing here is just the raw IPC and horsepower of Zen 2 architecture versus the little bit more optimized but harder hitting AVX instruction sets of Intel. And the score differences were pretty big. Multi-core on the AMD, we got 2615 on the 3300X versus a 2384 on the Intel. That's a very tangible difference. We're talking over 10%. And on single core, once again, that IPC definitely showing at 504 versus a 471. Geekbench. I don't know exactly what Geekbench's testing algorithm is and how it works, but again, it's another free benchmark you can download to compare your scores, just like Cinebench R20. The 3300X scored a 5331 in multi-core versus Intel's 5090. So again, that's like a 8% difference or so. And then single core, 1284 versus a 1263. Much closer, but once again, the higher IPC, lower core clock beat out the lower IPC, higher core clock. But games though. Let's talk about 3D Mark Time Spy. We know for a fact 3D Mark favors Intel. Why? Because it's got a calculation in there for CPU, for physics, which uses AVX AVX instructions, which is only available on Intel-based CPUs. So the CPU score for the 3300X scored lower, as you might expect, a 5078 versus a 5614 on the Intel. The GPU scored the same thing, which is kind of funny though, because the GPUs are independent of CPU test, but what we saw here is that the Intel edged out the 3300X by a bit, actually, at 12,551 versus an 11,901. And then again, on the combined score, that's algorithmic based on the GPU and CPU and the way they work together, a 10,588 versus a 9,904. Now, let me tell you this real quick. You're not gonna notice these differences. If this were a game, you would never notice this difference. In fact, there's times where we swear the run seems smoother on one platform versus another, and it scores lower. It's just another benchmark that we use to kind of see how some of the different instructions react to different CPUs. This is not us saying, oh, look, 3D Time Spy says this is a better CPU. Because if you use 3D Time Spy alone, 3D Mark Time Spy alone versus the other CPU tests, well, AMD won all 3 of those tests, but lost at 3D Mark DX12 test. So take that for what it is, but the game benchmarks, this is where it gets really interesting. And this is where we only did 3 titles, and we're gonna do a live gameplay of Doom Eternal, which we know is a highly optimized engine. It's interesting because Far Cry 5, which we know is a very CPU-bound game, and even their benchmark shows CPU load, was an average FPS of 119 on the Intel and 105 on the 3300X. Shadow of the Tomb Raider, much closer, a 113 on Intel versus a 110 on the AMD. But Rise of the Tomb Raider, which we know to be a very AMD optimized title, which is the older Tomb Raider, 150 FPS average at max settings 1080p in DX11 versus 139 on the Intel. So I feel like if we went through and did more testing with more titles, we would probably see those blows trade back and forth all day long, which is what AMD claimed, and that's actually exciting to see that a $120 part is on par and matching what was just 3 years ago Intel's top of the line part for mainstream. So let's go ahead and do this then. Let's jump into some Doom Eternal, which is a new title. It's an updated engine for what was Doom, and an amazing game that allowed you to get beautiful graphics and high FPS even on potato systems. Let's look for things like stutters and any sort of like texture pop-ins and stuff like that, just to see what the real-time gaming experience is like on this really cheap CPU. So we've got the metrics on in the game in Doom Eternal, and as you can see, we're getting 5 FPS. So if you wanted that much FPS, you got it. No, honestly, we're in the menu. So if you want to look down here, this is what we care about right here too, is what is our actual CPU usage, and as you can see, all 8 threads are doing something, and they're pretty highly utilized, which makes sense with the amount of frames we're throwing at it. In the game, that's gonna drop down, obviously. We've got a bit of a fight going on here. And this is extremely smooth. I mean, look at the FPS right now, 200. I'm probably gonna die because I do suck at this game. And I'm trying to kind of show something to you guys while I'm, uh-oh, see, I'm gonna die. Oh, I didn't even realize he was there. Yeah, I'm dead. Yeah, I'm not seeing any stutters, anything that's really like getting in the middle of the experience. I mean, these numbers look pretty promising, especially on a title like this. All right, so one other title we're gonna try here, and that is Counter-Strike Go. And the reason for that is it's a game a lot of people still like to play. It's withstood the test of time. And apparently this game requires a high FPS for people to not be mad with it, because the higher the FPS, the better the input lag, apparently. So we're gonna go ahead now. We're just playing offline with some bots on hard, which is kind of harder on the CPU because it's also running the server and the bots. And as you can see, we are getting 300 FPS. There's no stuttering, no like jitter, nothing. It's super smooth. It's actually quite amazing. 300 FPS. I mean, it's a 2080 Super, right? And look at the CPU. It's like nowhere near being loaded, so that means we're getting, it's gotta be up here. That means we're getting our GPU's worth.
Randy headshot, what?
Was it random?
Yeah, it was.
Where is it? Oh,
Yeah, look at that.
the
look
blinky
at that
light.
skill level. You would not call that red.
You don't understand, man. I used to be really good at Counter-Strike back in the day, and then 1.6, and then Source, and I just quit before Go, but I was really good with the flick shots. I really was. So a little bit of muscle memory, not a lot, but some.
Oh wow, nice call.
Counter-Strike, Go. Yes, go play Counter-Strike on this CPU. So when it comes to testing though, one thing I forgot to mention is that both of the CPUs were on all-in-one water coolers. We just wanted to make sure that everything was, well, not to mention AMD gave us the CPU in just a plastic bin, like no box or anything. So I don't know if they come with a box cooler. Normally the lower end CPUs do, but we were using an AIO with it, as you can see right here in this system. The 7700K also had an AIO. So the temperatures on these were extremely low. The 7700K was topping out in the 60s. This guy was topping out actually in the upper 40s, which is pretty ridiculous of how cool and quiet it is. Obviously your results are gonna vary based on your chassis, ambient temperature, and the type of cooler that you're running. But this CPU, given the fact that it's a 65 watt part, is not going to take very much in terms of cooling to keep it quiet and keep it well under any sort of throttling threshold. But is it worth buying? Absolutely. If you can take a $120 CPU, which is less than 1/3 of the cost of a 7700K when it was new, and get that level of performance in 2020, Intel fanboys, you can't double speak. You can't say the 7700K is a great gaming CPU and it's still a great value, but then say the AMD CPU at $120 that matches that value and actually surpasses it in multi-threaded applications across the board and say, well, that's not a good CPU. That's double speak. You can't do that. That's fanboyisms. We don't appreciate that around here. The performance you're getting out of this is great. 4 cores, 8 threads at $120. The 3100's next up on the chopping block in terms of getting reviewed. We're going to be comparing those CPUs though, that CPU probably to what the comparable $100 CPU that you can get from Intel is. And then I want to do some content too regarding overclocking, because the one downside of AMD and these CPUs is they do not have much in the way of overclocking headroom. I wouldn't buy a $120 CPU either expecting to overclock it and make it get yourself a whole nother tier level of performance. Anything above 4.2 on the Ryzen architecture and the Zen 2 architecture for some reason is just kind of a hard limiting wall that's really difficult to get past. And this one is boosting itself there already anyways. So yeah, more content to look forward to with that. So what are your guys' thoughts? A $120 7700K performing CPU? You think it's worth it? I think you would be hard pressed to argue why it wouldn't be. It's faster than any other $120 CPU you can currently get from Intel. And it's faster than the previous $120 CPUs that you could get from AMD. It's the perfect CPU to pair with a budget build and something like a 2060 or less. We showed with the 2080, you are losing some FPS in terms of general CPU limitations when it comes to putting an $800 graphics card, which is a terrible match for this CPU, and as you can see with the 7700K, it's also a terrible match. But if you start pairing something with it that's a 1660 Ti or a 2060 or something around there, it would be the perfect pair for a reasonably priced gaming machine that is snappy, it's quick, it's cool, it's quiet, it's efficient. All the things we've been wanting in an AMD CPU has made its way now to a ridiculously cheap price point. So sign off in the comments below how you guys feel about this. We will be testing the 3100, and then of course the entry-level CPUs for 10th gen Intel in the next few weeks. All right guys, thanks for watching, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.